welcome to the Deadline Club's Hall of Fame at Sardi's. I am Alex Tarquinio. I am the president-elect of the Society of Professional Journalists, and I will be your cruise director today. So we're all eager to hear from this year's honorees, but first we'd like to tell you a little bit about our organization. And to do that, we're going to get started with our current Deadline Club president, Michael Arena. Please give Michael a hand.
Okay, hi everybody. You know my name. It's been a great honor for me to be leading the Deadline Club. My term is about to expire at the end of the year, and I'm looking forward to a nice, long, good night's sleep. But in the meantime, I just want to tell you very quickly, and we'll move right into the program. This organization is 92 years old. It's celebrating its 92nd anniversary. And in New York, it was among the first in the city to step forward with its founding purpose to defend journalists' most cherished ideals, and that would be also to promote its highest ethics and to honor the best practices of the craft. We have been at it now for many generations, and we're very proud to say that we have a strong group of people. We're working very hard, and we're going to be continuing to do this in the years to come. It's one of the great honors to be able to transmit to succeeding generations the craft, to teach them, to talk to them, to mentor them. I know many of you in your own experiences have spent your careers doing those sorts of things, and I want to congratulate you for doing all of that. To give you a sense of, very briefly, what we've been doing, I'll just summarize very quickly. This year was a very busy year for us. Obviously, we're here today. You'll hear more about this event. But unlike other years, we had 5 or 6 different things that we were doing that we normally wouldn't do all in one year, so it was very compressed. We have our annual dinner, which we use to help scholarships for students, and this dinner was held in May at 260 or so people when you add everybody up at the Harvard Club. It was quite an event. We were able to fund 4 scholarships from this event and from our activities. We're very proud of that. Throughout the year, we do different seminars and panels of all kinds of discussions. Most of them, are right down the block here at the CUNY Journalism School, but that's one of the issues. We've held 3 or 4 of these. We promote understanding and knowledge of First Amendment issues. The interaction with the students, some of whom are here today, has been extraordinary. I want to say that over the course of the several years that I've been here, we've been able to bring more of that into the programming, and we hope to do some more of that going forward. I want to extend an open invitation to all of you here. The activities that we do rely on the people that are part of it. If you're not a member, please consider joining. Polly is right here. Please say hi to Polly if you can. Sign up with her or talk to her. She'll give you all the details. This particular event, which is a signature event for us, began 1975. We continued it for a number of years, and then 9/11 struck, and that's a lot of different reasons why there was a break. The biggest cause of it was just all of the trauma related to that event. And 6 years ago, someone came forward in our organization and basically was determined to reconstitute this particular event, which has been a tremendous success in the last 6 years. And that was our host tonight, Alex Tarquinio. She basically brought this back to life 6 years ago. So I'd like to have a round of applause for her. Okay, I'm going to get out of the way, but before I get out of the way, just a big thank you for all of the sponsors here today. CBS News, thank you. New York Times, thank you. Reuters, Rooney Partners, Time Inc., you've all stepped up. My friends here at Newsday are representing and supporting my colleague, my friend Les Payne, who I'm so honored to have with us today. So to all of the sponsors, thank you very much, and thank you for your support.
Thank you very much, Michael. Much appreciated. We are also very fortunate to have with us today the current president of the Society of Professional Journalists, so please give a hand to Rebecca Baker.
Thank you, Alex. Afternoon, everyone. I just have to say, I'm Rebecca Baker. I'm National President of SPJ. I'm also Deputy Head of News at the New York Daily News. What an honor it is to be in the same room with so many talented, accomplished journalists, particularly our honorees, and to just join together and celebrate journalism in these challenging times. And boy, are they challenging. We have a government now that is more hostile to the press and to the truth than we've seen since at least the Nixon era. Big difference is Nixon didn't have Twitter and Facebook to spread lies and propaganda. And public opinion wasn't so polarized that the First Amendment wasn't considered a partisan issue. But while the challenges are great, and fewer journalists now than there was back then, SPJ has been steadfast in seeking the truth and reporting it. SPJ has been there for journalists. Our Legal Defense Fund has given tens of thousands of dollars so journalists can fight wrongful arrests for doing their job and to be able to take public records battles to court. We've partnered with more than 100 open government and press rights groups to demand that the White House, Congress, courts, and even state legislatures be transparent and uphold the First Amendment. In other words, do their jobs. And we've trained more than 10,000 journalists over the past year through our online tutorials, seminars, chapter events, and at our annual conference. But that's not all. We are taking a lead in media literacy this year by going into classrooms across the country and talking to students about what a journalist is and what it isn't. We're asking every SPJ chapter in the country to host at least one public forum this spring to start a conversation with readers and viewers about where they get their news and why. And SPJ is building an endowment called the First Amendment Forever Fund that's going to be our war chest to bring litigation, underwrite lobbying efforts, and fund public education campaigns about the role of a free press in a democracy. See, these are just some of the many, many things SPJ is doing to protect and defend the First Amendment. But we need your help. Please, become a member of SPJ, donate to the Legal Defense Fund or our First Amendment Fund, or even offer a testimonial about why you believe in the work SPJ does. Let's work together to promote and defend a free press, because together we can make journalism great again, and again, and again, and again. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. And just a little more of a walk down memory lane. As Michael pointed out, I revived the Hall of Fame a few years ago. That was during my club presidency before joining the National SPJ Board. We are very fortunate to have my predecessor here as the Hall of Fame chairwoman. And let me tell you, I had some big shoes to fill. So please welcome Betsy Ashton.
Thank you, Alex, and hello, everybody. Just a little history about this event. As Michael told you, the New York Journalism Hall of Fame was established in 1975. It was part of a golden anniversary celebration. And from the beginning, the Hall of Fame was conceived as a Lifetime Achievement Award, recognizing reporters and writers, correspondents, editors, even publishers and media executives whose work has made a significant contribution to American journalism. Numbered among the original class of honorees were Walter Cronkite, Sylvia Porter, James Reston, and Lowell Thomas. More recent honorees have included Cindy Adams, Jimmy Breslin, Graydon Carter, Pete Hamill, Bob Herbert, Carol Loomis, Bill Moyers, Norman Pearlstein, Mike Wallace, Barbara Walters, and Gloria Steinem, among many other talented honorees. So you folks joining us today are in very good company. It's a fun event, often inspiring as we hear the thoughts of those whose work we all admire so much. Sometimes it even has drama. Never was there more than that. Some of you heard this story before, if you were here before, but it's a good story. Never was there more drama than 22 years ago, November 9th, 1995, when Mike Wallace and Barbara Walters were among those inducted. Here at Sardi's in this room, it was lunchtime. I was chair of the event. Where's Mike? He wasn't here. He had confirmed early that morning that he was going to be here, and his wife, Mary Yates Wallace, was sitting over there. I knew her well. That's a good sign. I went over to her like a couple of, where's Mike? He's coming. This guy said, I don't know. So I was trying to get everybody seated at the head table. We had a head table that time. It was up here, long stretch, and Barbara was fussing mightily. Where's Mike? Where's Mike? I'm not sitting down until Mike gets here. I want to sit next to Mike. Barbara, that's fine. I don't know where he is. His wife Mary is telling me he's coming. But we've got to get started because we have an event and we've got to get moving. Well, she sat at the ABC's table because she wasn't going to sit down until Mike came in the room. So we started eating because we had to start eating because we had a program and everybody had to get back to work. Well, all of a sudden, it's time to start the program, and I'm looking around, and where the hell is Mike, and what are we going to do? Finally, just as lunch was finished, and I had to begin the program, in stormed Mike and 60 Minutes executive producer Don Hewitt. They came in here, they looked like they were going to walk through the wall. Not kidding. They were absolutely, smoke was coming out of their ears. They were red in the face. I said, I think I better put Mike up first. Anyway, I called on him. He got up, he got his medallion, and he told the story of why they were late. They were meeting with CBS lawyers that morning. And for the first time ever, CBS attorneys crushed their story. It had never, ever happened to 60 Minutes before. 60 Minutes kept CBS alive for a while financially. And this time they could not air the blockbuster interview that they had taped. I thought Mike would spit blood. He was so angry, so was Don. Never, ever, ever had CBS interfered with the news judgment. This was the company that used to just say, make us proud. In this case, of course, CBS caved to the tobacco industry that morning. Fearing a lawsuit that the lawyers said could bring down CBS, the lawyers ordered Mike and Don not to run the interview that they'd gathered in a months-long investigative report on the tobacco industry. That man was Jeffrey Wigand. He was the vice president of research and development at the Brown & Williamson Tobacco Company, who had told Mike on camera that he and his staff had been ordered to find ways to deliver more of an addictive drug named nicotine and a possible carcinogen named coumarin into cigarettes. And that the corporate executives knew of those dangers despite sworn testimony that they had made before Congress to the contrary, and that they had instructed his labs to find ways to deliver more of these drugs into cigarettes. What a story. What a source. What a whistleblower. And on that day in 1995, CBS was scared to run it. Mike told that story here, right where I'm standing, in this room, to all the media heavies that were gathered here, and it was a blockbuster. As it turned out, the Wall Street Journal broke the story before CBS relented and allowed 60 Minutes to air the piece the following February. Now, you know as a reporter, and especially if you've ever been an investigative reporter, that if you've ever worked on a story and you had it and somebody else gets to run it first, you know how you feel. Anyway, in 1999, some of you may recall, a movie, The Insider, was made and Russell Crowe played Jeffrey Wigand. And the tobacco industry had to eat their words, and the rest, as they say, is history. But it was a sad day for 60 Minutes, yet we stood up here and we applauded Mike Wallace for his passion and his zeal and all the extraordinary work that he has done, as we will be applauding 5 of you today. I just might say, things may not be quite that lively this afternoon. Alex? Or do you know? I don't know. Maybe there's something I don't know yet.
We don't have that much drama on the program, but there are surprises. Yes, indeed, there are always surprises at these events. Well, I would not be a Hall of Fame chairwoman if I did not thank a lot of people. I'd just like to thank the committee, especially my fellow travelers in the selection committee, who were Michael Arena, Steve Dunlop, Keith Kelly, and Jackie Leo, as well as our program designer, Claire Regan, and our other volunteers, Melissa Hewley, Tricia Couture, Colin DeVries. We've already mentioned Polly, but give a shout out to her. And our cameramen today are Beethoven and Steve. Many of you met earlier. Okay. As in the past, today will be memorable. I can't say if it'll be as memorable as the anecdote we just heard, but we will induct 5 more illustrious New York journalists into the Hall of Fame. Over the decades, this day's honorees have entertained and enlightened us, and along the way, they've championed free speech and made our culture the richer for it. So without further ado, we'll move on to the awards. Nancy Gibbs is the editorial director of the Time Inc. News Group. From 2013 to 2017, she was the 17th editor of Time, the first woman to serve in that role. Nancy began her career as a fact-checker at the magazine in 1985 before rising through the ranks and along the way writing more than 175 Time magazine cover stories and covering 4 presidential campaigns. She won the National Magazine Award for her cover story of Time's black-bordered September 11, 2001 special issue. She is the co-author with Time's Michael Duffy of the 2 best-selling presidential histories, The President's Club, Inside the World's Most Exclusive Fraternity, and The Preacher and the Presidents, Billy Graham in the White House. She has received numerous awards, including the Matrix Award and the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Newswomen's Club of New York. Please welcome Nancy Gibbs.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to have an excuse to come hang out with so many of my heroes. We're invited to talk a little bit about our careers and our colleagues, and I do want to recognize my wonderful colleagues from Time, especially Edward Felsenthal, who has recently stepped into my shoes, if not my pumps, and I know is going to take Time to great new heights. I also want to publicly thank a man that I met on Time's softball team back in the days when we all used to spend Tuesday afternoons in Central Park because none of us had websites. We then decamped to the bars of the Upper West Side for extended story conferences. That all ended when he went off to help launch Time.com, but we've been playing ever since because we got married, and so that's all I want to say about the past, because this is a time for us to be in the present and to be thinking about the future. Last night I was speaking in front of a group of university students who are interested in careers in journalism and public service, and thank God, because we need them. I know you feel it. I know we all feel it. We feel something that is changing, something that has shifted in the way we're talking to one another and about one another. It is not a place most of us, even who've been covering American politics for many, many years, have ever been. To see politicians whose goal appears to be dividing rather than uniting us, to see news weaponized, to see our tools that we invented being used against us, so that what were once our unifying values around speech and civility and freedom and fairness are being shredded by these tribal furies, so that every day we wake up and we hear, or we read, or we watch a story that honestly would not have been imaginable to us when we entered this profession. If it's true that you can't hate someone whose story you know, if that saying is true, then I think it's an issue that so many of us are now living lives where neither at work nor at school or on a playing field or the coffee shop or the congregation are we encountering people who think differently than we do, who vote differently than we do, or pray differently than we do, or see the world differently do, much less hear their stories. It's essential that we all find ways to get out of our silos and break the filter bubbles and recognize that outrage has become a business model, that there is profit in polarization. And if we don't fight that, this is not going to get better. The stories that are complex and subtle and take time to tell have to be invested in. So I'm so grateful for this honor, but I'm even more grateful for institutions like SPJ, for the news organizations represented in this room, for the extraordinary, fearless work being done by journalists right now, because the need has never been greater and the stakes have never been higher. And if we get this right, maybe we can just save democracy and go back to playing softball.
Okay, thank you, Nancy. Yes, next up, Inar Kleinfield, better known as Sonny, started at the New York Times in 1977 after 5 years at the Wall Street Journal. He has specialized in feature writing and long-form narratives for the Times Metro desk. He wrote many of the stories about the aftermath of September 11th, including more than 100 of the Portraits of Grief sketches of the lives lost in the attack. He was one of the writers on the How Race is Lived in America series that won a Pulitzer Prize and Polk Award. His work has received numerous awards, including a Robert F. Kennedy Journalism Award, an American Society of Newspaper Editors Award, and I'm very pleased to say 5 Deadline Club Awards. I'd like to say that our judges have good taste. He is the author of 8 nonfiction books and has written for many magazines, including Harper's, The Atlantic, Esquire, Rolling Stone, and the New York Times Magazine. Please welcome Sonny Kleinfeld.
Thank you. I want to thank the Deadline Club for this honor. It was unexpected and it's deeply appreciated. I want to also thank the New York Times, where I spent almost my entire career, tolerating me for such a long time. I want to thank my wife, Susan. Shirley wouldn't be up here without all the support she's given me. And my daughter, Samantha, who's been a constant and enthusiastic cheerleader. In terms of how I got into this field, my father was an auto racing announcer, and he announced mostly at stock car tracks in New Jersey and also at the Daytona 500. And he wrote a column and stories about racing for a weekly auto racing paper. One of the great joys of childhood was my sister and I got excused from school every year for the entire month of February, so we went to Daytona so he could announce at the Speed Weeks. So starting when I was maybe 5 or 6, I went to all the local tracks with him, and throughout my youth, I fully intended and expected to become a race car driver. I even wondered at what point what was the best college for race car driving. And by the time I did get to college, after reflecting a bit more on all the crashes I had witnessed, I was sensible enough to not want to become a race car driver. But what stuck with me was how my father was able to inhabit the world of drivers by mingling with them in the pits and interviewing them for stories and for the benefit of fans at the tracks. And these were drivers who I looked up to with envy. So, he didn't get into the cars and take the great risks they took, though he did once compete in an ostrich race. This was the 60s. But he was able to acquaint himself, in a very vivid way with how drivers thought and felt. And that seemed awfully appealing to me, to be able to sample the lives of those who interested you through the vehicle of journalism. And that's what put me onto this road that I've never left. And along the way, I've rarely cared that much about the famous or the powerful. I've mostly been drawn to those who go unnoticed. People who readily invited me into their worlds without suspicion or setting boundaries, trusting me to show how their lives worked and who they were. And with them, I found more truth and fewer lies. They are commonly described as ordinary people, but I've always felt that's too small an adjective. To me, they're extraordinary people, and they're the ones who have kept me in journalism, and they're the ones I thank the most. Thanks.
Steve Kroft has been a correspondent with CBS's 60 Minutes since 1989. In 2016, the 12-time Emmy winner scored the last interview of Barack Obama as president. His stories in recent years included the first televised interview of the Iranian president after the country signed a nuclear deal with the United States, an investigation into insider trading in the U.S. Congress, and the failure to treat mental illness in America. Steve began his career as a correspondent for CBS News and served in the London, Miami, Dallas, and New York bureaus. He was awarded the 2010 Paul White Award by the Radio, Television, and Digital News Association and the 2003 Lifetime Achievement Emmy. He has received many other journalism awards, including George Polk, Peabody, and Sigma Delta Chi Awards. Please welcome Steve Kroft.
Somebody bring me some water. Okay. And we'll get you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Tricky part.
I should have had a rehearsal. Probably gonna need some water.
There's no shelf under there, unfortunately.
Try not to drop it on the microphone. I want to start by acknowledging the CBS table, David Rhodes, thank him for the sponsorship of this event. Jeff Fager, who I've known for 35 years and is currently the executive producer and my boss at 60 Minutes. Frank Devine, a longtime collaborator, and who's now a senior broadcast producer for the show. Maria Gavrilovic, Jennifer Vanessa Fica, Chrissy Jones, and my assistant, Ann Daly. I want to apologize at the beginning for reading from prepared comments. I figure it will be quicker this way. I've never been very good at ad-libbing or reading a teleprompter, all of which reinforce the idea that I'm not an anchorman. I want to thank the Deadline Club for this honor and for recognizing what's beginning to feel to me like a very long, long career. I stand before you in possession of one of the most valuable assets a journalist can have, and that's experience. It's not available to the young, the energetic, or the ambitious. You have to earn it one mistake at a time and be lucky enough not to make enough of them to get you fired. I'm often asked, what did I do before 60 Minutes? By people who are expecting a 30-second answer. So now that I've got a captive audience, I'm going to say a little bit about that and what I picked up along the way. I didn't start out wanting to be a journalist. When I was studying communications at Syracuse University back in the mid-'60s, I had my eye on Madison Avenue. It was the golden age of advertising, and I wanted to be a copywriter. Along the way, I had to take a number of journalism courses for my degree, and those journalism courses turned out to be my survival skills. In 1968, I was drafted in the largest draft call of the Vietnam War, and finally ended up, because of that background, a few years later, in the information office of the 25th Infantry Division in Cu Chi, South Vietnam, where one of my jobs was to escort reporters, journalists in the field. The first time I saw a camera crew from one of the networks and a correspondent come through the office, I knew immediately that that was what I wanted to do. And a few months later, I had a chance to join Stars and Stripes as a staff correspondent and photographer, which allowed me to not only work with a lot of much more experienced young colleagues who had done time at the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post and the New York Times before they got drafted, and also to spend time in the field with people in correspondence, working correspondents from the networks in the major newspapers and the wire services. It was a huge leg up. When I came back, I went to work for an affiliate, NBC affiliate in Syracuse, New York, where I mastered the now very rare skills of covering a courthouse, a police station, and City Hall, where I was able to learn some very important lessons from a bright, young, charming, idealistic mayor named Lee Alexander, who was chairman then of the National League of Cities and seemed to have a big political future. A year later, after leaving Syracuse, he was indicted on multiple counts of accepting bribes. Did a few years in federal prison. It taught me to be skeptical of all politicians and not to believe anything they say. My next stop was in New York, the journalism school at Columbia, where I had the amazing good fortune of having as my writing and reporting teacher the late Dick Oliver, who at the time was the city editor of the Daily News. He taught me how to write a good lead, draw people into a story, and gave me the confidence to be brave and not take any bullshit. His words, not mine. For the next 5 years, I worked for the two stations owned by the Washington Post in Florida, first in Jacksonville and later in Miami. This is just at the end of Watergate, and their licenses were being challenged by groups of wealthy Nixon supporters who were trying to get back at the Post for their coverage of Watergate. If you remember, there was a conversation between either Woodward or Bernstein from John Mitchell warning that Katharine Graham was going to end up with a certain part of her anatomy in a ringer if they ran a certain story. While I was down there, I got a lot of helpful guidance, extremely subtle, from people that were well-placed, strong enough to get a couple of grand juries investigations started, which I later learned, just by coincidence, involved a couple of the people who were actually involved in the license challenges. It taught me that things aren't always the way they seem. It taught me never to underestimate revenge as a motive, and the value of well-connected, highly placed sources. After that, I went to CBS News. where I did lots of stories the first year for Joan Richmond on the Weekend News and spent a lot of time on cold, rainy stakeouts like the one at the Dakota after John Lennon was shot. After 1 year of doing that, I was liberated and sent to the Dallas Bureau, covering the Southwest, where I went to a lot of grain elevator explosions and tornadoes and covered the war and got to cover the oil patch. My lasting memory from that period was my first trip to the shipping channel in Houston, where I became almost instantly sick with a headache from the fumes that were coming out of refinery after refinery after refinery after refinery, with all sorts of poisonous gunk in the ditches and high-tension wires all the way down to the Gulf. And I turned to my crusty old cameraman, Pat Odell, and I said, this is the ugliest place I've ever seen in my life. And he looked at me and said, son, this is what money looks like. I did a year in the Miami Bureau, covering cocaine wars in Dade County and guerrilla wars in Central America, before going on to the London Bureau, which was really my dream job. And I got a chance to cover the world, go into Asia, Beirut, South Africa, pretty much the whole world. And the best way to sum it up for me, that education continues to reverberate. And it was all summed up on a sign that was hanging on Jennifer Sieben's desk, who was the bureau chief in Paris. And it said, heaven is where the chefs are French, the mechanics German, the police British, the lovers Italian, and everything is organized by the Swiss. Hell is where the chefs are British, the mechanics are French, the policemen are German, the lovers are Swiss, and it's all organized by the Italians. In 1987, at the age of 41, I came back to New York, called back by Howard Stringer and Andy Lack to be on a new magazine show called West 57th. And shortly after that, I was fortunate enough to be called to 60 Minutes, where I had a chance to work with my idols and role models, Don Hewitt, Mike Wallace, Morley Safer, Ed Bradley, Harry Reisner, and Andy Rooney, and 2 years later, Leslie Stahl. All on a program that was at the time and still is, I think, the best television news show. I was a kid then, the new guy. And when I first started going out with my wife, I think which was on my first year at 60 Minutes, she told me that she called her mother and said that she was going out with a correspondent on 60 Minutes. Her mother said, oh my God, how old is he? That was 29 years ago, and I'm 72 now. And all those giants of 60 Minutes, with the exception of Leslie, are gone now, including Bob Simon, replaced with Scott Pelley, Charlie Rose, Bill Whitaker, and contributors like Anderson Cooper. So the show remains in very good hands. And Jeff Fager has had accomplished the most difficult skill and thing in task in journalism by filling the shoes quite adeptly of Don Hewitt. I'm sorry if it seems like I've dropped a lot of names today. It's not gratuitous in any way. It's just reminds me of some advice that I got a long time ago from somebody who was very smart. They said, always try to work with the very best. And if you're lucky, some of that's going to rub off on you. And I've been very lucky. Thank you.
Terry McDonnell was the editor of the Timing Sports Group from 2006 to 2012. He was hired as the 8th managing editor of Sports Illustrated in 2002. He previously held the top editorial masthead position at numerous magazines, including Esquire, Rolling Stone, Outside, and Us. He was inducted into the American Society of Magazine Editors Hall of Fame in 2012. In 2014, he co-founded Lit Hub. Terry is also a novelist and has written and produced for film and television. Knopf published his memoir, The Accidental Life, in 2016. He is president of the board of directors of the Paris Review Foundation and sits on the board of overseers of the Columbia Journalism Review. Please welcome Terry.
So when I got the call about this from Keith Kelly, I fear that I reacted the way I had been reacting to calls from Keith Kelly for many, many years. Yeah, no, I really? I said, Keith, are you sure? And we have a joke. The joke goes, he responds by that by saying, what do you mean? I'm first. Think about it. Anyway, when something like this comes at you, you have to take stock. You can't help it. You don't want to take yourself too seriously, but you want to have some ideas. And it occurred to me very early about, all of the important things that would be said today, and I could just say something like they said. What Nancy said, what Sonny said. But I thought about it, too. And I thought first about the earliest days I had in New York when I worked for the Associated Press. We made film strips then. And then a couple years later at Rolling Stone, and how much during that time I loved every bit of the media that I could see. And there was so much of that. And it was all booming, and the networks, and 60 Minutes, I think, was 5 or 6 years old. And I, of course, couldn't get enough of that. And PBS was getting better and better. And then there were the newspapers. And I always thought maybe I would be a newspaper person, newspaper reporter, but I never got to do that except for maybe almost a year at an alternative weekly, which we all know is not the same thing at all. That was a laugh line. But anyway, you did all the papers, the Daily News, the Post, the Times. Les's Manhattan edition of Newsday was fantastic. The Journal and on. And also the great magazine empires were, building on themselves here. They were beating their chests, flexing their muscles, starting new titles, and they had room for me, so I fell into the magazine business deeper and deeper. And I did move around a lot, and now here I am at the Deadline Club. So I'm thinking that I love journalism so much. I mean, I even love all the language of it. Deadline became one of my favorite words in the same way that I learned, that amused me to learn that, the Merriam-Webster dictionary notes that editor-in-chief rhymes with Great Barrier Reef. So I love that. So I got to be one of those sometimes, and that I learned along that trip that deadlines are romantic in a very fun and funny way, and that closing an issue early always spooked me. Just letting you know. Also, just saying I'm on Deadline can get you out of things. Or to make the right impression. I was thinking about, whatever work you do, being on deadline is like cooler. Like, think about it. An accountant is much cooler on deadline. Yeah? But best of all, deadlines, for me, at the beginning anyway, were about rewriting headlines. And if you could get that right, it was like being one of those Looney Tune characters and pulling a stick of dynamite out from behind your back. And I know a lot of you know about that because it's intoxicating. And when you're on, you just want to change everything. And there was nothing ever more fun than enormous changes at the last minute. Yeah. So I knew that this room would like that. Every magazine I edited had its own narrative, of course, and some were funny and some were sad, but they were all satisfying because of the quality of my colleagues and the really complicated work we were doing. And it was always collaborative, almost always, except at least up to a point. I think that I should, I'd make a special point because I was invited to sit with my former colleagues at Time Inc. And I want to especially point to the last 10 years when I actually had a job. When I was working at Sports Illustrated as part of Time Inc. and then I had some other responsibilities there. And that was 10 years, and specifically the last 5 years of that decade when I did a lot of digital development work. And there were times then when I would spend days or more than days, talking more to engineers and developers, and what was like a complete swarm of new digital vice presidents that than I ever did talking to the reason that I was in journalism, which was the other editors and writers and reporters and what the stories were about. I had a speech then about how change is good. And I still believe that because the future is always coming, et cetera. But now another 5 years have gone by, and it's not really agreed that magazines have anything much more than a past. Sometimes that's funny. I just would point out that at our table during lunch, we were bemoaning the loss of perks, and the conversation turned to the bureaus, the style of the bureaus at Time Inc. when they were always the building that was just a little bit better than the Saudi prince was living. But it really is serious, and watching all the talent disembark over the last 5 years, it felt to me like libraries were burning down, and it made me sad. And I carry that, but I carry it with some other thoughts about it that is where the thinking part of this. And I don't want to just be grumpy because we didn't figure out that we should have built commerce into our first browsers, which we should have done. We didn't do that. But there's still a lot to rethink. It's suddenly uncomfortably easy to suggest that the great innovative journalism that built the greatest media companies in the world is being certainly challenged, if not replaced, by an idea, the idea that you can actually engineer quality journalism or engineer creativity, which you cannot do. It's not simple, of course. Algorithms are wonderful, very useful, but data without insight is just that. I'm not just talking about magazines or magazine brands. we all have to differentiate ourselves with our reporting, our voice, our credibility on all of our platforms, which means that the traditional journalistic values that we all share and skills specifically too are more important than ever. I mean, even at the smallest detail, if you were good at writing those headlines I mentioned, it was like having a gift. But of course, some of the best editors I worked with were lousy at those headlines, in the same way that some people can't tell jokes. The connection is obvious. I'll tell you though, algorithms are really bad at jokes. The last time you had an online headline with a stick of dynamite behind its back, but the Twitter, of course, is made for this, of course, and we can all do a lot better there, and I'm cheating here and telling you that this is just a bridge to get me to Donald Trump, who I knew first as a man of golf, who sadly was very, very disappointed in me. Terrible editor. I was running the Time Inc. sports group, and part of that group was Golf Magazine and Golf.com. And through some just incredible misunderstanding, Donald's fantastic, amazing courses, his very special golf courses, very special, never somehow made it into the top of what my golf editors always did, which was the top golf courses in America. Shameful, dishonest. It was. Right, it was like early fake news. I think that was the first was a preposterous notion. But the good news now is that Trump's war on the press, in fact, his war on truth, his attack on all of that, seems to me to be underlining somehow and strengthening the confidence of editorial confidence. I see the kind of journalism that I like best, which is the reporting kind, all over the place. And it feels to me like it's getting stronger on all platforms, more audacious and more ambitious, and somehow truer. And I love all that, and it makes me restless. So it's within that context that I want to tell you that, as I started with, I love the work. I always have. And it's because it's fluid and it's nuanced and it's ironic and it has tides and seasons and in and out and maybe even some magic, and it's hard. And that's all so important. And I think that all of you know all of that, and you like it too. And that's why I think you understand why it's important to me and the way I feel standing up here in front of you today. And I like that most of all. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Terry, for reminding us that journalism matters in the age of algorithms, and for reminding us about deadlines as we reach our final honoree for this afternoon. Les Payne, better known as Les, is a former reporter, editor, and columnist at Newsday. During a quarter of a century, he held roles at the newspaper responsible for national, foreign, and health and science coverage, as well as the editor of New York Newsday. His news staffs won numerous awards, including 6 Pulitzer Prizes. Previously, Les and 2 other Newsday reporters won a Pulitzer Prize for a series of articles about the international flow of heroin from the poppy fields of Turkey to New York. In 1975, he co-founded the National Association of Black Journalists and later served as the group's 4th president. He has delivered the prestigious H.L. Mencken Lecture at the Enoch Pratt Library in Baltimore and was the inaugural professor for the David Laventhal Chair at the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism. Please welcome Les Payne.
Thank you. That's very
Well, good afternoon. It's a great honor to be here and to be even considered to be in the Hall of Fame of the Deadline Club and Society of Professional Journalists. I'd like to just say I'm really overwhelmed that so many people from Newsday came out. I mean, I left that place, retired 10 years ago. I thought they'd forgotten all about me. More than a dozen of them. I'm really impressed. And also the president of the National Association of Black Journalists, Sarah Glover, is here. Glad to see her. And my wife, Violet, is here. I knew she was coming. And our two children are here as well. They left. No, there they are. You heard enough. I deeply appreciate the presence of all of my colleagues in here, and I consider all of you colleagues. For some 38 years, I worked at Newsday, as was stated in the introduction, as a reporter, as an editor, columnist, and as a manager, and sometimes I did all of those jobs simultaneously. I used to, as Newsday could remember, would break out as a reporter on stories like the release of Nelson Mandela, the invasion of Grenada, the Tawana Brawley case, which Mike knows about, Mike Arena. In terms of how I got into this business and who I am and stuff you might not be able to find on the website, I was born in Tuscaloosa during the apartheid era. And that is the era that Jeff Sessions, Roy Moore, and Senator Mitch McConnell all want to bring back to Alabama and to the country as a whole. They want to make the South great again. That's their line. That was the South that I grew up in, was the Alabama of George Wallace. Some of you may not remember him, but it was Wallace who said, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. And I grew up, under that system. And as a child, I decided that I wanted, my brother reminded me of this, we used to lay in bed and talk about it. But as children in Alabama and Tuscaloosa, we used to lay in bed and talk about how we're gonna invest whatever talent we had into a career that could help prevent America from becoming and allowing its birth defect of slavery and racism to become its sickness unto death. That's increasingly harder now with President Trump. Early, I toyed with the idea of becoming a lawyer, until I discovered that as an advocate, you have to defend the culpable as well as the innocent. Someone asked F. Lee Bailey, how did it feel when you, in the middle of your case, discover that your client actually committed the crime and you got him acquitted? And Bailey said, well, he doesn't get off scot-free. There's always my fee. The nudge that finally turned me toward journalism in a way, finally from the law, was when I was a soldier in Vietnam, and I didn't know Steve Kroft was a soldier. By the way, I was also the Army's version of a journalist, but don't get your hopes up. I worked on General Westmoreland's staff. I ran I was the officer in charge of his newspaper. And for a while there, during that introduction, I was afraid that she was going to say that the story that Michael Wallace was so concerned about was the one with Jerome Westmoreland. But at any rate, the story the incident that really turned me toward journalism, when I was in Vietnam, still thinking about the law. My wife and I were married, had a young baby back at home. And I was still thinking about the law when I got back, when and if I got back from Vietnam. And the nudge that turned me is that there were Army trucks in Vietnam, the AmeriCal Division. Remember the AmeriCal Division? The AmeriCal Division was a division that Lieutenant Calley was a member of, and Lieutenant Calley did the My Lai massacre. But they were flying flags, they were flying on their trucks Confederate flags. And Jesse Lewis, who was a reporter for the Washington Post, wrote a story about this. Now, I'm on Westmoreland's staff. He wrote a story about this in the Washington Post, it caused quite a stir. And to his credit, President LBJ called Jerome Westmoreland at 3 a.m. Saigon time and chewed his ass out, which delighted me, that there were American GIs fighting in Vietnam under the Confederate flags, which was a direct insult, obviously, to every African American who was dying at the same time in disproportionate numbers in Vietnam. And it was at that point when that story appeared, and it convinced me, that Post story convinced me of the power of the revealed facts reported by a free press protected by the Constitution, which is determined to inform the public about what is going on. And my grandmother, I'm sure others have said it as well, always used to say that people will do better if they knew better. And I was impressed that maybe we could find a way in journalism to inform people, and maybe they will do better if we do our job as journalists and help them know better. So as a U.S. Army Ranger captain and newspaper veteran, I signed on as a rookie reporter at Newsday in 1969. The pay was very low. I mean, it was a third of what I was making as an Army captain. And that first year, my wife and I and our young daughter, who's here, we got by on roots and berries, pull up weeds. I mean, we're living on Long Island on that pay, which I'm ashamed to even tell you how low it was. Unlike television and what you guys are making nowadays. And the Newsday City Room, I gotta say a word about the City Room of that day, because we look back with nostalgia, but the Newsday City Room, and I should say there was a generation before me. I was a rookie in the old timers. These were pre-war veterans who were running the City Room. And Bill Moyers, who had just left the Johnson administration and was a publisher who hired me, by the way, Bill Moyers, who I understand is also in the hall, as it was mentioned here earlier. And Moyers noted and wrote and was quoted in the Newsday book as saying that the newsroom was like a Wild West rodeo with the editors as the bulls and the bucking Broncos. Harvey Weinstein would have been quite at home at Newsday in those days, I could tell you. The job was tension-filled, as you all know, and I checked when I was in the service the actuarial tables, and it placed the life of a journalist back then in this late 50s and 60s at around 45 years old. And I'm in the Army, I'm saying, what am I getting into? The life expectancy of a journalist was lower than that of someone in the military. You can look it up, as they say. They died of circulatory ailments, and it was also a place, the City Room, where acute alcoholism passed as social drinking. These days, instead of the bars, journalists go, after work, journalists go to the gym. Or worse, as Jimmy Breslin observed, who's also in your hall, home. My wife, thank God, is laughing. And let me just say that the baby boomer generation at Newsday has made a significant difference in journalism with this extraordinary coverage that the competition overlooked. My career in journalism has been a swell ride. I mean, I've had, as many of you, a ringside seat as involved in history over the years. I've helped clock the demise of apartheid in South Africa, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the horror of 9/11, the folly of the U.S. military displayed abroad. And along the way, I've interviewed world figures such as Nelson Mandela. I remember I interviewed him when he was released from prison in his backyard in Orlando West in South Africa, sitting down interviewing Nelson Mandela with the world's press there. I've chatted with Norman Mailer about boxing. I've watched artists such as Romare Bearden work in his studio. And once, and this was quite foolish of me, I was, in those days I was arrogant, don't say anything. And I used to read Jean-Paul Sartre all the time, and I could have said to myself, I love Sartre, you know, and Kierkegaard and others, but Sartre. And there was a French playwright who had come over, he was covering the Panthers, and I was covering the Panthers, and he was stuck at the University of Connecticut. He had spoken there, he was stuck there, so I gave him a ride from the University of Connecticut all the way back to Brooklyn, where he was staying. And I was arguing about Sartre with Jean Genet. Now, how stupid is that? I mean, you know, Sartre wrote Saint Genet, which is a 1,000-word tome. And I was arguing. By the time we got to New Haven, I had nothing to say. I mean, I was absolutely speechless. I listened from New Haven all the way to Brooklyn. But it was fun. But it's not been all fun and enlightenment, as I've been run out of 6 countries. 3 of them, as a journalist, I've been run out of 6 countries, 3 of them at gunpoint. The Tom Macoute, Haiti, knocked on my door. Believe me, you do not want the Tom Macoute to knock on your door. I was run out of Uganda when the State Research Bureau of Idi Amin came to my hotel room on the 11th floor, which turned out was a killing floor. They had taken journalists out of there and killed them, of the international hotel there, and said, come with us. But at any rate, we can talk about that in detail later. What I'd like to close on is that I was run off the island of Corsica by the gunmen of Marcel Franzesi. And at that point, Marcel Franzesi was the head of the French Connection in the 1970s, and he was a top heroin smuggler in the world. I was on a newsday assignment to trace the flow of heroin. 80% of the heroin was coming from Turkey at that point. We were there as an introduction to trace the flow of heroin from the poppy fields in Turkey. We went to Turkey, a 3-person investigative team. We were in Turkey for 3 months. And then we went to the south of France, where it was converted into, from morphine base into powdered heroin in the Marseille region. And at any rate, I was run off Corsica by the gunman. I mean, we got the last, Chris Cook and I, some of you may remember him, took the last plane off the island. Luckily, with gunmen in the parking lot. But at any rate, on the question of heroin, this was in the 1970s, and there was 250,000 heroin addicts in New York City. This is the 1970s. And most of them were black and Latinos. In 1971, there were some 1,100 heroin-related deaths in New York City. 1,100 in 1971. Half of them were less than 23 years old. They were mainly in Harlem, in Bedford-Stuyvesant, and the concern was not what it is now. The heroin epidemic back then was dealt with as a criminal justice problem. Cops didn't arrive on the scene of a heroin overdose with naloxone. They came with handcuffs. The bad cops even hoped that the victims undergoing an overdose would die and save them the problem of booking them and send them off to Attica. That's the way it was in the 1970s. The heroin, and worse than that, was that the heroin epidemic we found was imposed on the black community by key elements of La Cosa Nostra, the police, and disinterested politicians. Black teenagers, street gangs, were becoming politicized and discovering that black lives mattered. And the establishment seemed to prefer that these black teenagers and Latinos be strung out on heroin than that they be high on James Baldwin, Malcolm X, and Franz Fanon. The heroin opioid epidemic, of course, is back now upon us, with some 90% of the new addicts being white New Yorkers. Last year, there were 1,374 opioid heroin overdose deaths in New York City alone. The society has gone from handcuffs to hugs. It was treated as a medical problem, as it is treated now as a medical problem, as it should have been during the earlier heroin crisis of the 60s and the 70s. In both cases, the addict resorts to the opioid drug to relieve some pain or misery in their lives. The good news is that the media is on the case. As but one example, the Washington Post and 60 Minutes did a timely investigation disclosing how politicians are enabling the pharmaceutical industry to feed the opioid heroin crisis these days. And were it not for Bill Whitaker of 60 Minutes show, President Trump, he watches television, would have appointed a chief political enabler of the opioid crisis as the nation's drug czar. For me, this would have been like President Nixon back in the 70s, appointing as his drug czar Carlo Gambino, who was a capo di tutti di capo. However, Congressman Tom Marino was persuaded to remove his name from consideration as drug czar thanks to the investigative work of 60 Minutes and the Washington Post. The need for such vigilance encouraged by the media standing up to inform the American public has never been more critical. And I'm not one of those old fogies talking about the good old days, because the good old days were never that good. The best days of news reporting are ahead of us. And given Trump, Pence, and Paul Ryan, they had better be. I'll close with my kicker. I see Ken Paul over there. They gave me a birthday at Newsday some years ago, and Ken Paul, to my surprise, came up with what he called Payneisms, sayings that I used to say all the time. I don't even remember it. The only one I remember is that I used to tell when I was a manager and an editor, I used to tell my young, Paul Moses, one of my editors, I used to tell them when they ran into a troublesome reporter who just couldn't get them to get the story, I said, look, this was a Ken Paul Payne, you can't make turkeys fly, but you can make them run real fast. And I said that because coming out of the subway, this is honest to God truth, I told my wife about it yesterday, a guy walked up to me, and he didn't call it a Payneism. He said, you know, I used to see you on television, and I still use a statement that you used to say. I heard you say some years ago. And my advice, and I'll use that Payneism, to the young reporters here, and the not so young reporters here, fighting to get the facts by whatever means, and this it is, don't pull your punches. Wade in. Tell the truth and duck.
Thank you. Thank you, Les. Oh, I think we want one more picture. And I do want to thank you for giving the truth to the introductory remarks of being both entertaining and enlightening. And thank you, everyone, for coming. Big round of applause, final applause for the honorees.